you'll be able to work on the problem set with others on Wednesday, and you can continue working on it at home. And as always, you can contact me for questions. So what we're going to do now is take our knowledge about the path of excitation and contraction and turn it into blood flow, and then turn that into understanding the so-called Wiggers diagram. That's what we want to get to, is the Wiggers diagram. This is an important way of seeing the heartbeat that cardiac physiologists use. So let's review the heartbeat with better knowledge of anatomy and physiology that we now have, and think about pressure and flow. Diastole. Blood is returning to the right atrium from the previous heartbeat. What valve is this? I'm going to start trying to tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is open because pressure, now here's the key point, because pressure in the right atrium is greater than pressure in the right ventricle. So blood, because blood is flowing into the right atrium. So pressure holds the tricuspid valve open, and blood flows into the atrium and into the ventricle. At the same time, blood is returning from the lungs to the left atrium. The pressure in the left atrium is higher than the pressure in the left ventricle. The bicuspid or mitral valve is open, and blood flows from atrium to ventricle. The ventricles are refilling. The muscle is relaxed, refilling. This slide has something that's confusing, and I want to clarify the confusion. It looks like, wait, what's this arrow and what's this arrow? What is that about? This is the flow. So if it weren't for these closed semilunar valves, there would be backwards flow. But there isn't. So you should basically take your slide and sort of cross that out. Did I give you this one as a handout? Yeah. So this arrow shows that there would be backwards flow, but the valve is closed. The pulmonary semilunar valve is closed, and the aortic semilunar valve is closed. It's actually closed by a little bit of, remember we saw in the lab, well, only some of you saw in the lab the sort of the cup of the semilunar valves. This backwards flow closes these valves and prevents the backwards flow. So there is no flow. These arrows are not flowing. Okay, that's the confusing thing about this slide. These arrows are what close these valves. Okay, clear on that? Diastole. Okay, the sinoatrial node has depolarized, reached threshold, fired an action potential, spread throughout the atria. What's the signal on the ECG?
The P wave?
The P wave. The atria contract. Both of them contract. A little bit of blood that was in the atria is now squirted through the AV valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, from the atria into the ventricles. Just a little bit of blood. Most of the filling, this is key, really, it's pretty important. Most of the refilling of the ventricles happens during diastole. About 15% of the refilling of the ventricles is due to atrial systole. So those of you who go into a clinical field, you might hear of something called atrial fibrillation. It's real common in the elderly. I would bet half of your grandparents have it. Maybe a quarter. And atrial fibrillation is when the atria are not contracting. But those people, especially in the elderly, those people are walking around fine because the atrial contraction only accounts for 10 to 15% of the refilling. We need it for exercising. Elderly need it for exercising too, and so they don't exercise quite as vigorously. The main point is, atrial systole, this contraction of atria, only accounts for about 15% of the refilling of the ventricles. Good? What keeps these valves open? No, not the chordae tendineae. The pressure being higher in the atria than in the ventricles. The chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles do not hold these valves open. That's a real common misconception. We'll get to what they do in just a moment. I'm really glad you mentioned it because I wanted to clarify that. What keeps the semilunar valves closed? Pressure. Where is the pressure higher and where is the pressure lower that keeps these valves closed?
Higher in the artery or
Yeah. Pressure is higher in the aorta than in the left ventricle, so that keeps that pressure that would cause backwards flow, keeps that closed. The pressure is higher in the pulmonary trunk than in the right ventricle. That pressure would cause backwards flow, but it doesn't because it closes the valve. Okay, what happens after atrial systole? Ventricular contraction. So now, right, we go septal, then apical, then pre-wall. We're turning the QRS complex and the depolarization of those myocytes into contraction. But we're going to do it in phases. So look what happens first. So this is the first phase. The right ventricle contracts, the left ventricle contracts at the same time. Before the contraction, I just went backwards in time. Before the contraction, the AV valves were open and the semilunar valves were closed. At the very beginning of the contraction, pressure builds up in the right ventricle and pressure builds up in the left ventricle. And when the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the atria, it closes the AV valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. But the pressure in the ventricles has not yet gotten higher than the pressure in the pulmonary artery or the aorta. And so the semilunar valves are still closed. So we have contraction going on, but all the valves are closed. Volume cannot change if there's no flow. So we have contraction, but it's called isovolumetric. Contraction happening, but no change in volume. Isovolumetric contraction is the first phase of contraction of the ventricles because it has closed the AV valves, but has not yet opened the semilunar valves. But that's what's going to happen next. Contraction, pressure in the right ventricle exceeds pressure in the pulmonary trunk, pressure in the left ventricle exceeds pressure in the aorta, opens those valves, ejection of blood. Ejection of blood. Until When? Until the ventricular myocytes stop contracting and start relaxing. So when the ventricles start relaxing, pressure decreases. When the pressure in the right ventricle falls below the pressure in the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary semilunar valves closes. When the pressure in the left ventricle falls below the pressure in the aorta, the aortic semilunar valves close. The pressure has not yet fallen below the pressure in the atria because the atria have been refilling throughout this time. Well, pressure in the ventricles is still greater than the pressure in the atria. So again, all valves are closed, but the heart is relaxing, and this is relaxation, but it's isovolumetric because there's no change in volume if all the valves are closed. And then finally, relaxation, pressure in the right ventricle falls below pressure in the right atrium, refilling. Pressure in the left ventricle falls below pressure in the left atrium, refilling. And we're back to where we started. So maybe I'll do this as clickers later, but let's do this now. What closes the AV valves?
The high
Pressure in the ventricles. The closing of the AV valves causes a snap, a click. A click, when muffled by the sound, when going through the chest, becomes a boom, or some of you may love the dub. So the click of the valves closing becomes a sound that you can hear with the stethoscope. And it's the first heart sound. The closing of the AV valves becomes the first heart sound, that click. The closing of the semilunar valves at the end of the heartbeat, beginning of relaxation, becomes the second heart sound. So what we hear normally is the closing of valves. The first heart sound at the beginning of systole is the closing of AV valves. And the second heart sound at the end of systole is the closing of semilunar valves. We typically don't hear flow because it's silent, unless there's a murmur that you may have heard of a heart murmur, and we can get into that in the lab. There's time to talk about that. Yes?
So for the valves and the ventricles and
Aorta. You mean the atrium?
atrium, I use the filter version. What is the benefit of having 3 on the right side and 2 on the left side?
I don't know. Why did we evolve tricuspid and bicuspid? I don't know. I'm not sure there is a reason. I think it might be just one of those things. Yeah. The seal of the valves is good. If there is blood squirting through a valve when it should be closed, you can hear that sound. That's the sound of a squirt of blood, and that's a murmur. Yeah, valves are good. Okay, so now let's get to the Wiggers diagram. You're going to understand this in just a few minutes, believe it or not. I promise you, you will. This is the Wiggers diagram from your book. Your book does a good job of walking you through the Wiggers diagram. With the, first we start at number 1, then number 2, number 3. The book, if you use the book and walk through, what are we seeing here? What are we seeing here? What are we seeing here? The book does a good job of it. But this is too small for you to see. So I'm going to use a different image to walk you through it. But let's use your book picture to get oriented, because they all look pretty much the same. Pressure, volume, electrocardiogram, sound. The Wiggers diagram, some of them show some things and not others, but it's almost always pressure on top, volume, ECG, and sounds. So what do we see here? The purple is the pressure in the aorta. The big hump is the pressure in the ventricle, and specifically the left ventricle. We're more interested in the left side than the right side, and so we look at the aorta and not the pulmonary trunk. We look at the left ventricle, and the right ventricle is sometimes not even shown. In your book, it's shown. This is the right ventricle. Oh, I'm sorry, no, this isn't even the right ventricle. This is the left atrium. So this is just the left side of the heart. The aorta, the left ventricle, the left atrium. But sometimes you can see the atrium is not so informative. Sometimes they don't even show the left atrium. Pressure in the aorta. Pressure in the left ventricle. Pressure in the left atrium. Volume of the left ventricle. Going up during diastole and going down during systole, during contraction. Pumping of volume means the volume in the ventricle gets smaller. QRS complex, sounds. We're going to put this all together. And I'm going to show you a video that I think is helpful. And I should have set this up before, but I forgot. I really should have set this up.
I think you're missing an L at the
Did I not copy the L? Oh, good, okay. So now let's enable the flash. Okay. So the images in your handout are stills that I captured from this video. And I know it's hard to see because it's colored, so your handout is hard to parse. So let's look at this image. And I'm going to dim the lights a little bit so that it's easier to see. And then we're going to go through it. I'm going to show you the movie, and then we're going to take snapshots at various times, stop it at various times, and go through it. So, this is a cartoon of the heart. And so you can see blood flow and then flow, right? Blood flowing from the atria into the ventricles during diastole and during atrial systole, and then the atria are going to contract, the ventricles are going to contract, close the AV valves, open the semilunar valves, and blood is going to flow out the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So this is a cartoon of what's happening in the heart. Same thing, aorta pressure, left ventricular pressure. Let's not worry about left atrial pressure. Ventricular volume. So in this graph, it puts the pressure and the volume on the same graph. This is the scale for pressure. This is the scale for volume. Pressure is in millimeters of mercury. Volume is in milliliters. But aortic pressure, left ventricular pressure, left ventricular volume, ECG, sound. So let me play the movie. So this is the time bar sweeping across, and this is the cartoon of the heart. And it's going too fast for me to narrate. I can't keep up with it. But just form this image in your mind of the fact that what we're doing is scrolling across this in time, and we're going to capture specific, I'm going to leave this, and I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to capture specific moments in time. Okay? So here is the first PowerPoint. So this is the first one in your handout. I gave you a handout of slide 6, right? Okay, so what is going on here? So if what you should mark on your slide is that this is happening during diastole. So the first slide, slide 6, is diastole. During diastole, ventricular pressure is low. Ventricular volume is increasing because it's refilling. The electrocardiogram has not yet started. Silence. No sound. Okay, I'll do that again. Low ventricular pressure, high and increasing ventricular volume. Nothing happening electrically because the heart is at rest and refilling. Nothing happening in the sound because it's silent. Aortic pressure is higher than ventricular pressure, and we'll talk about that on Wednesday, why that is. Okay, then the next slide, slide 7. Where are we? We're at the very beginning. So what happened here? Where did we jump? We jumped from diastole to atrial systole. The P wave has happened. That's pretty much the whole story here. The P wave has happened. A little bit of blood, a little bit of atrial pressure built up. But since I don't even ask you to focus on the atria, but there's a little bit of atrial pressure building up because of atrial contraction. The ventricular volume has increased a little bit because we've squirted 10% or 15% of the total blood that the heart is going to pump from the atria into the ventricles. But basically, ventricular volume is high. It's as high as it's going to get. We have done atrial systole. Okay, what's happening now? We're still in atrial systole. Why did I show you this? I don't know. We're still in atrial systole. The P wave has finished, but atrial pressure is still pumping blood from atria into ventricles. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now, what have we done? We've gone into isovolumetric ventricular contraction. The QRS complex has happened. It's just happened. We're microseconds after the QRS complex. What did the QRS complex do? Spread of depolarization from septum to apex to free wall, starting the contraction. It closed the AV valves, generated the first heart sound, no change in volume, because the valves are closed, and a dramatic increase going to happen in the next millisecond or 10. Dramatic increase in ventricular pressure now about to happen as we contract isovolumetrically. Ventricular pressure is skyrocketing. Ventricular volume is not changing. Aortic pressure is not changing yet. The closing of the valve caused the first heart sound, and the QRS complex has just happened. Okay? I'll do it in a slightly different order. The QRS complex has just happened. We have we're just starting contraction of the ventricles. The contraction of the ventricles closes the AV valves, which generates the first heart sound. The continued contraction of the ventricles is going to generate a very rapid rise in pressure. The volume has not changed yet because the valves are all closed. Okay, what happens next? Well, the pressure builds up to the point where the semilunar valves open. At the opening of the semilunar valves, let me go to the next one. Well, okay. So at the very beginning, the semilunar valves open and we start to get ejection. We are about to see the decrease in ventricular volume. That's just about to happen. We are about to see an increase in aortic pressure. That's just about to happen. The increase in ventricular pressure, the ventricular pressure has just gotten above aortic pressure because that's what opened the aortic semilunar valve. Opening of valves does not generate a sound unless there is stenosis or some other disease. So let's go to the next one. Ventricular volume, ventricular contraction, and ejection is continuing. Ejection of blood. Ejection is silent. The ventricles are completely contracted. They're all depolarized, so there's no electrical signal, right? This is the time when the ventricles are completely all contracted. There's no longer any spread of excitation. They're all contracted. Which is higher here? Aortic pressure, which is in green, or ventricular pressure, which is in red. The cartoon makes it look like they're exactly the same. But you know that can't be true because we have flow and we have an open valve. Which is higher? Which is actually higher, the red line or the green line? The red line must be higher, just a little bit higher than the green line. But it's only a little bit higher because we got this big hole, right? So we've got this big thing open, so the pressure here is only a little bit higher than the pressure here because we have this big connection. But it's still higher and we're getting flow. So aortic pressure has gone from high to higher, but it's still lower than the ventricular pressure by just a little bit because we still have flow. Okay, what happens next? We're going to skip reduced ejection because it's still ejection, and we're going to go to isovolumetric relaxation. So the contraction has stopped. The T wave, the repolarization vector, time and vector has happened. repolarization has happened, relaxation has happened, or is starting, relaxation is starting, pressure is decreasing, closure of the semilunar valves, second heart sound, ventricular pressure is falling and it's now below aortic pressure, and ventricular volume is at its minimum. Right, let's go back. I think I skipped this. During rapid ejection, volume is decreasing, right? Because the blood is being injected. So now, at the end of ejection, the volume is at its minimum. This minimum is called the end systolic volume, and this maximum is called the end diastolic volume. The volume at the end of diastole and the volume at the end of systole. And you can see the volume goes from about 150 mLs to about 50 mLs. So what volume was pumped?
Can you repeat what you just said?
Hmm?
Could you repeat? the
Yeah,
name?
so this is end diastolic volume, when the volume of the ventricles is maximum at the end of refilling. And this is end systolic volume, when the volume is at the minimum after contraction, after all the blood that is going to pump is pumped. Are the ventricles completely empty? Well, we're not worried. We're only talking about the left ventricle. Is the left ventricle completely empty? No, it's still got 50 mLs of volume in it. So it's got some residual volume. It started with 150 mLs. It ended with about 50 mLs. The volume that was pumped by this heartbeat is 100 mLs in this cartoon. It's typically closer to 75 or 80. Okay. Isovolumetric contraction, relaxation, because the ventricles are relaxing, all the valves are closed, the ventricles are relaxing, pressure is decreasing dramatically, but volume is not changing because all the valves are closed. When the closing of the valve is associated with the second heart sound, closing of the semilunar valves, second heart sound. So let's look at systole. Systole, contraction, ventricular systole, ran from the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. Pumping of blood, pressure, went from the beginning of the isovolumetric contraction to the end of isovolumetric relaxation. That's systole. So we have an electrical measure of systole, we have a pressure measure of systole, we have a volume measure of systole. It's all measuring the same thing with just slight variation. We have a sound measure of systole. From the first heart sound to the second heart sound is so systole, 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 systole. Whether you measure it by sound, ECG, volume, or pressure, different measurements of the same thing. Okay, let's continue. What happens after isovolumetric relaxation? Oh, okay, continuing isovolumetric relaxation, and now we have refilling. The pressure in the ventricles has fallen below the pressure in the atria. The pressure in the ventricles has fallen below the pressure in the atria. Opens the AV valves. Opening of valves is typically silent. Don't hear it. Opening of valves is not an electrical event. Don't see it. Opening of valves means the volume is increasing in the ventricle because it's now refilling with blood. So this is, the Wiggers diagram embeds a ton of information. And it's your job to parse, to translate this information into a form that your brain can comprehend. I think the movie, so you can cut and paste this URL from the PowerPoint, which is on Moodle, into a browser, and you can play the movie, and you can stop it at other points and see what works for you in terms of where to stop it. But playing the movie might help reinforce what's happening in real time. It's pretty close to real time because, after all, the heart is beating once a second, and that thing takes about a second to play. So it's actually running a little slower than real time, I think. But it's too fast to talk about, but it's not too fast to watch. And then you can freeze it at specific points and try to understand what's happening at that point in time. Or you can just walk through my snapshots and try to understand what's happening at the points of time that I stopped it at. Or you can go to the book and follow the story the way the book tells it. The aortic pressure, left ventricular pressure, left ventricular volume, ECG, and sounds. And at home, I think, you can do clickers. You don't have to do them here. I just say we're pretty close to done for today. We have it done 10 minutes early. And so you do the clickers, go through the Wiggers diagram, and internalize the things that I've been teaching you about. Remember, you don't have to internalize atrial pressure events. You don't have to figure out why do we get this thing called the dicrotic notch. It's got a name. You don't have to go there. If you want to look up dicrotic notch, and the internet will tell you. Don't focus on atrial, focus on ventricular pressure, ventricular volume, aortic pressure, electrocardiogram, and the first and the second heart sounds. If you want, on Wednesday, I can explain these somewhat abnormal third and fourth heart sounds. Maybe we'll do that on Wednesday. Questions now before we break up?
What is the function of the core tendon?
Good, okay. Have a seat for this, so let me. What is the function of the papillary muscle and the chordae tendinei? Chordae tendinei. They do not hold the valves open. What they do, the tension on the chordae tendinei caused by the contraction of the papillary muscle prevents the AV valves from blasting out the wrong way under very high ventricular pressure. Remember, the left ventricle especially is generating a lot of pressure. This pressure is very high. This pressure is soon going to be high enough to open this valve. And we've got to keep this valve closed. And if this valve didn't have support structures from the chordae tendinei and the papillary muscle, it would blast out the wrong way, and we would get regurgitation of blood from the left ventricle into the left atrium. But because of the chordae tendinei, that doesn't happen. Robert?
Are papillary muscles under constant tension, or
Are they what?
are they under like constant tension, or do they contract?
They sort of yes and yes. So papillary muscles, let's go through this whole story. Papillary muscles are somewhat contracted during diastole. But they're mostly relaxed. And the tension here is not what holds these valves open. But there is some tension there. They're a little bit contracted. But the big story is that during isovolumetric contraction and during rapid ejection, the tension on the papillary muscles increases, the contraction increases, the tension on the chordae tendineae increases, preventing regurgitation through a reverted valve. But, so the short answer to your question is, for our perspective, we want to think of them doing the job now, during systole, keeping great tension on those chordae tendineae. Good question. Good question. Thank you very much. Other questions? Okay. Wow. Okay. Catch my breath. Go have the rest of your afternoon. Work on the problem set. Work on the clickers. Work on your textbook. I'll see you on Wednesday afternoon.